Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us on this Saturday afternoon. We've invited you all here today for this little Christmas get-together and official book launch of Navigating Disruption, Media Relations in the Digital Age, written by Bertrand Teo. So let's begin with a bit of background about the author. Bertrand, who was born in Indiana and raised in Singapore, has spent a good decade as a journalist and public relations manager. The book we're all here to hear about was written while he took his master's degree at NTU Wikimi School of Communication and Information, which is where I was lucky enough to meet Bertrand. And one of the first things that struck me about him was that he is one of the most thoughtful and deliberate communicators you will ever meet. Everything he says with great forethought. And from what I've read, this book is definitely written in Bertrand's signature, insightful style. So without further ado, let's hear from the man himself. Hi, Bertrand.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Tanu.
Hey, I like the Christmas tree at the back. That looks good.
Yes.
Really getting into the season, aren't we?
Yeah, I'm getting to the season. It's my favorite time of the year. I want to thank everyone for joining me in this session. It's a really meaningful time for me, and I really appreciate sharing it with you. Um, and I also want to thank Tanu for hosting the session. She is super talented. She's always been a magnetic and energetic presence in class, and I'm so grateful that she's here to host this session with me.
God, wow. Okay, we can spend a few more minutes on me if you like. I mean, I'm happy to hear a few more compliments. Well, Bertrand, I think no one really wants to hear about me this time around, but we're all eager to hear about navigating disruption. Let's start off with how the idea for this book even came about. What was the seed that sparked this book to life?
So it's a confluence of factors, I would say. There are three main motivators for me to write this book. The first being that I really believe in telling Singapore stories. And so I think that Singapore stories, is a great way for building national identity and social capital for Singapore to get people outside of Asia to understand Singapore better as a nation and as a people. So that's why I want to tell my story. The second reason is that, I'm working my master's now. I'm still in the midst of my master's program, and I thought, what better way to better reflect my modules and to better share with my fellow classmates with my own professional Bible of sorts. So by writing this book, it will help me to reflect better on everything that I've learned and to better share with everyone. The third reason is that I felt I have a unique story to tell, a story that would probably benefit fellow communicators. And so that is another reason. And I'll share a little bit more later about the book and what it means for communicators and people who are laypersons as well.
Okay, very cool. So I totally get what you mean about being able to offer that unique perspective. I mean, Singapore in general is just, we've always been at that crux between East and West. And you are a perfect example of being right in that crux because you spend so many years working in the media industry in Singapore and also in the US. So you've got that perfect balance. So I think it'll be a really interesting perspective that you bring to this book. Now, in terms of the title, Navigating Disruption. So this is a really interesting title, especially this year. I think with COVID-19, it's the biggest disruptor of all. So did you see a gap in the knowledge around disruption that needed to be filled?
Well, I didn't see that way that there was a gap that, of knowledge that needed or that this book would have helped to fill. It was more of I was something that I was personally invested in. I mean, as a corporate communications professional, someone who's engaging newsrooms all the time and trying to pitch my stories, it's always been a challenge, especially like we mentioned with COVID-19. And even before that, before the pandemic, there was digitalization that caused disruption in the newsrooms. And it was always harder, I think, for media engagement people to seed stories. And so I used my book writing journey and in my interviews with experts in the industry to try to seek the answers.
All right. So you said you wrote this book for yourself. So who else did you write it for? Who is the target audience for the book? And who do you think would really gain the most from it?
So I think this book is for people, for readers who are interested to understand how newsrooms operate. How journalists tell stories and create narratives. It also dwells into the corporate communication function and describes what it is about and how corporate communicators can engage audiences through the media. Okay, that's it. I think this book is really for everyone because communication as a whole is, I think, is integral in our society. You know, governments, private organizations, they all need to communicate. They need to share. They need to share about their goods and services. The government needs to convey what their policies and what the initiatives that they're doing. So I think it's even a lay person would appreciate it. Even for seasoned communicators, I think there's something in it for seasoned communicators because communication technology is ever evolving. There's new technology, new social media apps like TikTok that has an active usage among young people, and our communication laws as well is always being updated. So I think there's something for everyone, seasoned and even aspiring communicators. And okay, let me delve into a bit more about the book. If I can, I'll pull up some slides here.
Nice.
So, okay, let me just share screen. Okay, if you can see right here, this is the breakdown of the book. So I hope you all are able to see properly. So the book is divided into 3 parts, 11 chapters into 3 parts. The first being about how digitalization has transformed the newsroom. The second part is about how corporate communicators can engage audiences. So it's a bit of a how-to guide. The third part is about provides a glimpse into the future of communications, and I interview industry experts to share more with me. And as you can see, the book is wide-ranging. There's so many key themes and topics that I talk about, from media bias and minority representation to freedom of expression, our ever-evolving media consumption habits, and I end off with important topics like strategy and campaign planning and content marketing, as well as social media crisis communication. So let me do a bit of a deep dive into each part. The first part is about how digitalization transformed the newsroom. And I framed this through my own personal journey as a student journalist and then later as a TV news producer. In the first chapter, I talk about my days in the US newsrooms as an intern, and I share a bit about how I felt the laws of the land influence how newsrooms operate. So in the US, there's the First Amendment that really encourages freedom of expression because it says that Congress cannot create any law to curb freedom of expression. So
it's a bit of a shock as a Singaporean to be exposed to the First Amendment.
well, I think Singaporeans are, I think here we also, I think I see a lot of Singaporeans speaking our minds all the time, right, online and in the public sphere.
Yeah.
So, but then there are times in the book I describe some situations where, for example, I think there's some influencers who were told to, they couldn't say certain things in public, and then there were concerts that were stopped at the very last minute. So I describe all these things in the book and how I felt that some of the OB markers in place may kind of curb creatives from telling their stories. So, in this book, I talk about a little bit about the differences between Singaporeans and Americans in very broad strokes. Of course, things are always a bit more complicated. Yeah, so that was the first chapter. In the second chapter, I go into my time in a newsroom, a newspaper newsroom in Louisville, Kentucky, where I was a journalist, intern journalist, and I went out to report on just all kinds of different stories, from businesses to natural disasters striking certain venues in the city. And it was here that I witnessed a retrenchment exercise in the newsroom. And I got to see how newsrooms were tangibly disrupted by digitalization. So I share about this in detail in the book. And later on in the third and fourth chapters, I go into my time as a TV news producer, what's the life of a TV news producer, how we create content, how we get information from wires. And then I talk about how I saw the way newsrooms evolve from the traditional functions to the digital functions. In the second part of my book, like I mentioned earlier, it's a bit of a how-to guide, but I also go into a bit of Singapore media history. I talk about the time when this period known as the media liberalization, when SPH and MediaCorp were competing with one another in their own, for example, SPH had a TV station, and then MediaCorp had their own newspaper, and they were competing. And I explain why this happened. And then
many years ago.
Sorry?
Many years ago.
Yeah, early 2000s. Yeah, so this in the early 2000s, I talk about my time in school and how young people started to adopt blogging technology and social networking sites, and that started the journey for many new media players to come up with the many wonderful new digital players out there, like the motherships, the must-share users, the influencers. So I describe all of that in the second part, as well as influencer engagement. I speak to an influencer to find out more about what are some of the best practices. And in the third part is a glimpse into the future. And I begin with an interview with Professor Edson, and he shares about, I draw a parallel between our laws in place, for example, the newspaper and Printing Presses Act, and then I compare it with the POFMA. And then I go into things like internal communication, corporate storytelling, as well as I end off on a note on the skills that are needed for corporate communicators today. So I get some experts to share a bit more about things like content marketing and strategic campaign planning and so on and so forth. So let me hide the slides, so I'll stop sharing screen for now. Okay, how do I?
Yes, that was great. Thank you so much, Bertrand. So that gave us a real in-depth look at the book and the journey that it took. And I love that you really did take us on a journey. You know, you went through the history and you went through the present and the future. And you're completely right that things changed a lot from the early 2000s, because suddenly a lot of those barriers, they disappeared just like that, didn't they? Because suddenly you didn't need a certain license to be able to produce content. You didn't need to get approvals for this or that. As long as you had access to the internet, you can be a content producer. And that's really one of the biggest disruptors that came out of this in the last 20 years, for
Yeah,
sure.
people consuming news for free. I think now so many people are just used to consuming information for free. They're not going to pay for it. So then, what is the way forward for new media players, right? It's just a very complicated field.
Of course, it begs question about the quality of the information that you're getting as well, whether
Yeah,
that's
certainly.
accurate, and there's so many other things that's coming up from that. So it's really, really quite interesting. So from what I can tell, you've interviewed quite a number of experts for this book. So could you tell us a little bit about that process, and who did you interview?
Okay, so I interviewed 5 experts. In part 2, in chapter 7, I interview an influencer I mentioned earlier, Fauzi Aziz from the Smart Local, and I talked to him about influencer engagement. So he shared about best practices, and he shared about something called the autonomy of content, where audiences now are in control of the kind of content that they want to see. The second expert I spoke to was Professor Edson, and I talked to him a little bit about minority representation in the media and POFMA. So he talked about that and fake news as well, and what he thinks is the way forward. I speak to Vovo Wong. He's a managing partner at a digital PR agency, and so they're doing some really groundbreaking work at Inform, the PR agency that he runs. And he talked to me a bit about the future of communication. Some of the topics are AI and ethics, as well as how to deal with fake news and strategic communications, what he thinks is necessary for young communicators to learn to be able to apply some strategy towards engaging the media. I speak to Xiao Qian. She's an expert on social media, and she shares about content marketing and how to better engage audiences through narratives online. And the final expert that I spoke to, in fact, he's the first person I spoke to when I went about, trying to write this book, is Mr. Ferry Bakker. He was my teacher for 2 semesters at NTU, and he taught me so much. This book is there's a very big imprint, a bit much of influence from him. He shares with me about corporate storytelling. And in that chapter, I talk about how we can use the corporate mission, vision, and value statements to come up with a message house design for corporations to tell stories. So much credit to Mr. Ferry for it, and I thank you that he's able to join us today.
Okay, great. Wow. So you really interviewed a whole range of people there, from influencers to people who are experts in their field, to practitioners and people who are teaching the subject. And you've done my job for me in the sense that you have introduced our next guest for us. So Ferry, as he's fondly known to friends, students, and everyone who meets him, is our next guest speaker. So Ferry, hi. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, good to see you, and good to see Bertrand. So
good to see you too. Could you share with us your thoughts on the book? So you were one of the first few people to even hear about this. So what were your initial thoughts when Bertrand came to you with this book? And now that you've read it, it's completed, what is the impact that you believe it will have on readers?
okay, well, when he first mentioned he wanted to do this, my first thought was, I will need to do everything in my power to make sure he does, because it's not easy to first of all, write a book and then get it published, particularly by such a prestigious publishing house. And also, the reason why I think this is so important is actually written in my foreword, and it is also expressed by a guy by the name of Eric Schmidt. He used to be, until recently, the CEO of Google. Okay, he said just a couple of weeks ago, the sooner we can get the next generation given all in charge, given all the errors that we have made, the better it is. And I'm actually saying this in my foreword as well. And I've also expressed it recently in a webinar on the future of Singapore, because I really believe that it is time for us, particularly communication, to say, thank you very much, guys, for what you have done, and let the next generation take over. And my statement was that if all students in Singapore, are equal to the ones that I have been teaching at NTU, then this country has nothing to worry about for the future. And I really, really believe that. So when you take this book and start reading it, you get to understand why this is. It really is very insightful when it comes to how communication is changing and how the tools of communication have completely changed in the last couple of years. But I was particularly taken by the first part of the book, which is a reflection on his time in the United States, because it is so eloquently written, and it makes such good points that it really is a joy to read it. So, so that's my most important point. When he and I talked, I mentioned a whole range of anecdotes and on how great communicators and great CEOs have used corporate storytelling to get their points across. And it is an art, it's not a science. And you really need to be good at it, and to have the talents to be good at it. But when you are, you can make incredible impact on the people who you are working with, on the students that you are entertaining in school, and in your day-to-day life. Corporate storytelling and storytelling in general to make your points is very, very important. So.
Most definitely. I completely agree with you that my favorite part of the book is also the front part where he has that honest and heartfelt introduction, and you feel his fear when he talks about having to go to uni in the US, and you can totally understand that because it's such a different environment, and to be able to see that firsthand and the difference in the media industries and the changes in the communications industry that was happening globally, you can see that happening throughout the book. So it's really quite a fascinating read, and thank you for sharing that bit about corporate storytelling as well. So you also contributed to a chapter on that in the book. So do you want to give us a couple more insights if you have them, without giving too much away, because we still want people to buy the book, obviously?
Well, one of the examples is an assignment that I did, which took about 2 years, for the Royal Netherlands Army. And that was to help the army to recreate its mission for the future. This is, like I think about 20 years ago when I did it. And it was the most successful project ever in my life. And there were 3 reasons for it, which made it different from other major mission statement, purpose development assignments that I got from companies, as wide-ranging as Boeing, ABB, KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, Akzo Nobel, and so forth. So, and I was thinking, why is it that the Army project was so much more successful than any other project that we do? And the 3 reasons were, number one, it was the first time that these people had worked with consultants. Now, if you are a consultant, particularly a management consultant, and you work with companies, after about 2 years, they get tired of you and they want another consultant, okay? So they didn't have that. It was all new for them. And number 2, unlike people who work in the government, in non-profits, and in private industry, when you give an order in the army, people follow it. They actually do what they're supposed to be doing.
And that's a big difference.
So to get this gigantic program that encompasses, over 300,000 people, to get that successfully off the ground and communicated and implemented helped when, we were telling the generals and whatever, else came there, that, this is when you have to do, this is when you have to do it, and this is what the result must be. And number three, in the army, people have time, which is also something that normal individuals like us don't have. We have no time. There's too much that needs to be done, and all has to be done right now. So those three factors contributed to the success of a very important project. So, and here it's just a bit of corporate storytelling for you.
There was also this thing about Yen Carlson and SAS. So there's another story in chapter 9 where Ferry shared with me about change management through communication. So that's an interesting anecdote as well. And that was the basis for me to work out the message house design and go about talking about it.
Very cool. Definitely a lot of real life examples in that book. Just a quick reminder for our participants also, we definitely still have that Q&A function on the bottom right of your screen. So if you have any questions so far, either for Bertrand or for Ferry, just feel free to drop them in. You can also, I think, post anonymously if you're feeling a little bit shy, but if you're a comms professional, come on. So, if you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them in. And Ferry, I think I got one last question for you, if you don't mind. I believe that the report on the future of the Chief Communication Officer was also mentioned in the book. So could you tell us just a little bit more about that?
Okay, so about 2 years ago, I had a conversation with one of the best practitioners that is currently alive, and his name is Alan van der Molen. He, for 13 years, held top positions at Burson Marsteller, and then he switched to Edelman, did the same thing, and then he moved on to We Communication, where he only stayed a short period of time before joining SC Johnson as Chief Communication Officer. And this, looking at our jobs today, we felt that number one, quite often, internal communication, employee communication, was taken over by the HR department. For example, Deutsche Bank, a few years ago, did a major change management program with McKinsey, and not a single communication officer at Deutsche Bank around the world was involved in this. So to me, this is completely ridiculous, obviously. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, we saw that the role in investor relations had become one of tactical support, implementation, rather than the role that we used to have, also in terms of content. And number three, we saw, among other things, by the way, the increasing power of the chief marketing officer, who believes, or believed that all communication would be and had to be part of his or her remit. On the other hand, okay, we saw that today, the need for strategic corporate communication advice that CEOs have is greater than ever before. So that's why I decided, let's do a research project of which my students are going to be part. And this is what we did. And what followed was indeed a major concern. One of the questions we wanted to have answered was, if you look at the role of the corporate communication or communication officers in the next couple of years, what is going to be the biggest challenge? And unanimously, the respondents said employee engagement. Now, here's the interesting point. When we started the research a year later on employee engagement, we started this in February of this year. It turned out to be like an incredibly important subject. Indeed, we did this research together with Edelman, the PR firm, and with Mercer, one of the leading HR, consulting firms. And then COVID-19 arrived. And that changed a lot. First of all, the role of the chief marketing officer became less important than it was before. And the role of corporate communication and communication became more important because CEOs rightly, and leaders of states rightly saw that the need of communicating to populations, to employees, where there is a chance that a company may even go under, had become incredibly important. So COVID-19 changed actually the outlook of the future of the chief communication officer, in our opinion, and also in the opinion of the people whom we interviewed. So very, very important, very, very interesting. So I would see that in the future, if the communication people grab this opportunity, both the in-house communicators and consultants, then there is a lot of work for us that is going to be highly regarded and valued by the C-suite and particularly by the CEOs.
Definitely, nothing brings the value of communication to light like a crisis, right? For sure. So Bertrand, yes.
Okay, so there are some questions that I thought maybe I can answer at this point in time.
Yes.
So Anna, Anna, Anna asked about let me read this question. We hear a lot about the digital age, something in my book that I mentioned about, that I talk about rather. So how has the meaning of digital changed now as opposed to 5 years ago? So I think that the word digital has shifted over time when it comes specifically to the way we use the internet and when it comes to devices that we use. So in the early 2000s, for example, that's where I share a little bit about my own experience as a student and learning how to use computers and the internet in our computer labs in school and at home. That was primarily very much web-based. And so companies and other organizations, they use the internet as a digital presence, as a web-based presence. And then later it evolved with social networking sites. So with social networking sites, people can put up their identities online and they're able to have a presence and share their thoughts, what they like, what they prefer. And with blogs as well, they are able to write do some journaling about their life stories and write about issues that they're concerned about. And then now in the past few years, we've seen mobile devices like your iPhones and now the internet, the digital, what this means to us, I think, is that it's omnipresent. It's everyone is so tapped into the digital sphere, and we are telling our stories there. We are interacting, communicating, and that's why the internet, digital communications, it's the primary, in the most integral form of communication, I think, in these few days and in recent years, and it will be the primary means to communicate going into the future.
Definitely. And we've got another question also, I think. Hi, I would like to ask, do the practices mentioned in the book apply to communicators in other countries?
So what I share in the book, I think the case studies for myself are primarily for Singapore. When I paint a portrait of the media landscape, that's the Singapore media landscape, and talk about the new digital players as well as our traditional media giants like SPH and MediaCorp. But I think that, like I mentioned, Ferry had shared about some examples about the Dutch Army and about SAS. All these examples are international. And I think that what I shared in terms of the skills, what communicators need to know when it comes to digital storytelling, I think that is applicable for everyone in urban areas. In most urban areas are pretty similar, I would say, in the way we use digital communication. And I think that what I shared in this book is applicable for people in other countries as well.
Okay, cool, most definitely. And I think we've actually got one more question which got dropped into the chat. So how much do you think your book will influence our policymakers to review or revisit their national policies?
I think that the book, what I shared in the book, is something that our policymakers are aware about, and it's something that they've been reviewing for a while. This book is an introduction. It gives a good overview for communicators, for aspiring communicators, and it talks a little bit about the new technologies and how media consumption habits are evolving. In in chapter 1, I talk about the First Amendment, the constitutional First Amendment in the US, where it encourages freedom of expression. I think that area might be something that policymakers might want to consider and look into. I'm sure that this topic is this topic of censorship and what can be reported and how we inform our public is something that is debatable and it is there are many complexities to it. But perhaps when it comes to creative storytelling, in terms of encouraging more people to tell their Singapore stories, that could be something to consider. How maybe we can enliven our own local storytelling and our standards of storytelling by just letting people be able to voice out more often on their thoughts and maybe encouraging a better internet environment so that there are third-party people who will step in to say that some protocols should be observed, some code of conduct should be observed instead of the government saying that this shouldn't be allowed. So I think that's something, the point of view in my first chapter will be something to consider and to read about and to, it's just a point of view. And in the book I also talk about this nation building model in journalism. So this is, again, I bring out all the different points of view and I'm not saying what is right and what's wrong. I do have my own preferences, but it also paints a picture of how things have developed since the days in the past when our founding father had crafted when a founding government rather had developed the laws of Singapore. I think it was in a very different situation when there were racial riots. So, and there were threats, national threats from other countries. So now in this environment, I'm not sure whether I can say it's a lot safer. I'm sure there are other national threats and other forms of fake news and deep fakes and all these things are other issues that we are facing these days. So perhaps the policymakers can consider the new risk and then see how the policies can be crafted to better encourage safety and as well as for us Singaporeans to tell better stories and not just Singaporeans, but all storytellers to tell stories about Singapore.
Definitely. Different times, different challenges, right? For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we might have maybe one more question. There we go. Writing a book from Prasanna. Writing a book involves challenges, including but not limited to getting started and hurdles along the way. How did you overcome them, and what is your message to aspiring writers? And I'm going to add to this because, as I understand it, you wrote this book while you were taking your master's degree, Bertrand. I'm sorry, were we taking different courses? How did you find the time for this?
So I wanted to say up front that I've always wanted to write a book. It's something, an innate desire, something on my bucket list I've always wanted to do. And while doing my master's, this is the perfect time to reflect upon what I've learned over the years, especially in an environment where I have access to experts like Ferry and yourself, Tanu, as well. Your contributions to class are very insightful. And to everyone at NTU who's on this session, all of you have contributed in one way or another in the way in how you've shaped my worldview and what are some of the tactical best practices when it comes to communications. So I absorbed all that and I've used it for the book. Before I entered my master's, I had a small manuscript written already in terms of the how-to guide. I had this how-to guides for myself when it comes to communications best practices. So that was the sort of the cornerstone for me to work out the rest of the draft. And during my master's program, it was really having the discipline to go into outlining everything and writing each chapter and shaping it so that it forms a coherent thematic flow for the book. And then it was about interviewing the experts and hearing the stories and then letting that shape my own story, this book as well. So it was a very it's a tough journey. I think that the desire to write a book really pushed me towards trying to get it done, but otherwise it was tough to juggle it, I'm sure. And good for us that we have the holidays to work. At least for me, I tried to use my holiday time and downtime to write the book.
Right. So while I was using my holidays, lying on the couch, catching up on Netflix, and being one of the oldest people on TikTok, you were writing a book. That sounds about right. Okay, so we actually have one more question. I do realize that we are overrunning a little bit, but hopefully everyone's having a relaxing Saturday afternoon and we can stay on for just a little bit longer. So one last question, how different is it to tell a Singapore story?
How different is it? I think it is not any different from any type of storytelling. It is about people who understand this country and our culture, and maybe they're Singaporeans, maybe they are foreigners who have come here and embrace Singapore culture. And I think that it is about sharing that perspective of how life is like in this city, our hawker culture, just our HDB living, the things that Singaporeans love, the food that we eat, and just very unique personal experiences about our life here. I think that all can be the basis for writing great stories about Singapore. So it's about your own experiences, or it is about interviewing people and understanding their experience, understanding topics that are related to Singapore and writing about it through research. So I always hope that more Singapore stories can be told. In the book, in the introduction, I talk a little bit about how other countries or Western media outlets may not understand the nuances of Singapore. And so it's important that we tell our own stories. And I hope that by telling my own story, I'm taking one step. And I know there are many great storytellers out there, Singaporean storytellers who are telling stories about Singapore. So, kudos to them. And I hope we can all come together and make the world more aware about our way of life, the way we do things. And maybe they can adopt some things that are useful and they can improve their own livelihoods as well.
I'm sure you're definitely inspiring a few people on this call to pull up their book outlines as well. Yeah, exactly. Go write a book. No, you've got December, you've got a few weeks, write a book. So thank you all for the amazing, great questions. So just FYI, the book is currently at 20% off for a limited time only. So be sure to snap it up at GoGuru. The link will be flashed in a little bit. Special thanks to Ferry for taking the time to join us as a guest speaker for this book launch. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today for the launch of Navigating Disruption, Media Relations in the Digital Age.